Hi, this is Dr. Matt Garcia, State Beef Specialist for Utah State University. It's been a while since we had a video installment for our Beef Producer Educator program, so I decided I wanted to do one today based off of the antibiotic use card that we've actually developed. This card basically goes into some of the practices and why we utilize antibiotics and some of the regulatory factors that are kind of put on us when we use antibiotics in the beef industry. And although that we know that our industry does use antibiotics, we do know that there is some producer responsibility associated with that. In terms of utilizing antibiotics judiciously, following the label instructions on the antibiotics. There are some misconceptions about how we utilize antibiotics in the beef industry and how it affects our food supply. Most of our producers are very judicious in using antibiotics. They follow label instructions. The reason for this is the cost. While the American public, a good portion of our public thinks that we just use antibiotics and we're injecting them kind of frivolously into our animals, the fact is most producers try to avoid using antibiotics either through better management practices, better husbandry practices, because antibiotics actually increase the cost of production. It increases our production costs. It also means that if we're having animals that we're having to regularly utilize antibiotics on, basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to take an animal who's become inefficient, sick, and we're trying to invest more in them to get them into the point where they can be productive, a productive part of our production system. Now, although most of our producers are very judicious in how they utilize antibiotics because of some of the penalties, which we'll talk about in a little bit, there is a misconception of the public that animal agriculture is driving this superbug bacterial resistance phenomenon through the use of antibiotics, and we're responsible for it. I've seen numerous articles saying that we are. However, the thing is, anybody who is utilizing antibiotics is contributing to the superbug antibiotic resistance. I mean, if you think about it, we're using antibiotics. Human medicine utilizes antibiotics, and bacteria, are very good at evolving, adapting, selecting genetic lines that are resistant to things that kill them. If they weren't, we would have wiped everything out with penicillin. And I know there's some producers out there that are my age or if not older that when we went to the doctor as kids, the antibiotics we got as children are much different than the antibiotics that we receive now. And the reason for that is because those antibiotics they gave us as children are now less effective. Bacteria have developed resistance to them. And that's the case with everything. Now, for the most part, we are regulated very, very stringently on how we utilize antibiotics and how we incorporate antibiotics into the food animal system. USDA, FDA, EPA all regulate, how we utilize antibiotics. And now we have the Veterinary Feed Directive, which mandates that we have to have a feed directive from a veterinarian prior to utilizing antibiotics in the feed at certain time points. Now, the other thing the American public kind of forgets about is that our producers realize there's certain times during our production system where animals are going to get sick. Weaning, transitioning into that next phase into the feeder cycle, transitioning to a stalker cycle, transitioning from a stalker into the feeder cycle. Animals get stressed, immune systems get suppressed, animals, get sick. And these are time points when producers typically are looking to utilize antibiotics. So there's kind of a double-edged sword there. The American public tells us, well, we don't want you to use antibiotics, but if we don't utilize the antibiotics, we have animals that get sick, animals that will die. So there's an animal welfare standpoint to it. And I would argue that from a producer standpoint, we're looking at this from an animal welfare standpoint. We want to keep these animals healthy and productive, and healthy. We don't want to see them, wither away and die during the production process. Now, kind of going back, we are heavily regulated by USDA, FDA, and EPA. When we utilize antibiotics, every antibiotic has a withdrawal time, meaning that if we inject those antibiotics or we utilize those antibiotics, there is a strict time point until that animal can be utilized for harvest. That animal has to be able to metabolize that antibiotic prior to being harvested. If that withdrawal time isn't followed, residues will be detected on that animal's carcass, and that producer will be fined. Now, part of the problem with that is that if a producer is found in violation and residues are detected on that, because USDA does randomly test for antibiotic residues on carcasses, they're put on a violators list, and which can lead to higher scrutiny when they market their animals, which can also lead to decreased or no profit of those animals. Now, that being said, our producers are very vigilant about utilizing antibiotics responsibly. They're not overutilizing them because the cost associated with it would just be atrocious. But we're also regulating the fact that people are also watching. These government agencies are also watching how we utilize them, making sure we're not abusing them. And just to give you an example, in 2011, USDA conducted a study where they actually tested for 128 different chemicals on carcasses. Meaning they're tested for antibiotic residues, a number of different things, and 99% of those carcasses were free of chemicals because our producers are judiciously using them. They're adhering to that withdrawal time when utilizing antibiotics, and they're utilizing these in a way that they should be utilized, adhering to that withdrawal period, so there's not residue in the carcass. Now, with that, we will be continuing these beef educator program videos. If you have any ideas for some cards or some issues that you'd like us to develop some cards and videos for, feel free to contact me directly. If you'd like some cards sent to you, contact me and I can go ahead and get those out to you as well. Thank you for watching, and we'll be seeing you again soon.